The room is small, white walls, a single chair in the center, no phone, no music, no book, just you, and a button on a small table beside you. A few minutes ago, a researcher attached a small device to your wrist. You felt the shock. Just once. It hurt. Not badly, but enough that you told them immediately you would pay money never to feel it again. Now they have left the room. The door is closed and everything is silent. Just the faint hum of the ventilation above you. Your own breathing. Your own thoughts. 15 minutes, that is all. Just sit here. And the button is right there. You already know what it does. So obviously you're not going to press it. But most people pressed it. That result was published in the journal Science. And it raises a question that should bother every one of us. What has happened to us? How did we become a species that would rather hurt itself than sit quietly with its own mind for 15 minutes? The answer starts somewhere you would not expect, inside the brain itself, during the moments when it does absolutely nothing. And it goes back further than you think. In 2001, a neuroscientist named Marcus Raichle was studying brain activity. He wanted to compare what the brain does during difficult tasks with what it does during rest. The resting state was supposed to be unimportant, the boring part, but the scans kept showing something unexpected. Whenever people stopped focusing on the outside world, certain parts of the brain suddenly became active. Not random activity, a consistent pattern. The same regions, communicating with each other again and again. Raichle called it the default mode network. And for years, the scientific community ignored it, then tried to explain it away as a mistake. An experimental error, a glitch in the data, because what it was suggesting made no sense at the time. That the brain has a second life, one that only begins when you stop trying. Once researchers started studying it properly, what they found changed everything. When this network runs, you replay memories, you simulate your future, you think about other people, what they feel, what they want, how they see you. You ask questions about yourself that you never get to ask when you're busy. The quiet moments that feel unproductive are often the moments the mind spends trying to understand you. In 2018, a researcher at the University of Waterloo named James Dankert confirmed exactly this. When people are left alone without stimulation, the brain shifts into this mode. It stops reacting to the outside world and starts processing from within. This is the work the brain never gets to do when you are busy. But this network has one enemy: stimulation. The moment your attention is captured by anything, a notification, a video, a song, it stops immediately. Everything it was doing simply halts. In 2024, neuroscientists placed electrodes directly inside the brains of patients undergoing surgery. While those patients were awake, they gave them a creativity task, then stimulated this network with a small electrical current, just enough to interfere with it. The patient's answers became less original. Immediately, the moment it was disrupted, creativity dropped. The study was published in Brain, a peer-reviewed neuroscience journal. This network is not just present during creative thinking, it is doing the work. Your best ideas, your unexpected connections, the solution that appears from nowhere in the shower, all of it traces back to this one network, the one that only gets to run when you stop doing everything else. And you have probably felt this before. A solution appearing after you stop trying to force it, a thought surfacing during a quiet walk, an answer arriving late at night when everything else finally became still. You know the feeling. For a moment the noise disappears, and something underneath it begins to speak. But modern life makes those moments harder and harder to find, because something now fills nearly every empty space. Something small enough to fit in your pocket, and the moment it arrived, silence started disappearing. So here's the question that should bother you. If this network builds your creativity, your empathy, your sense of self, why does modern life seem designed to make sure it never runs? To answer that, we have to go back a long way. The word school comes from the ancient Greek word skole. Skole didn't mean education. It meant free time, not free time used for entertainment. Free time used for thinking, conversation, reflection. The Greeks believed some of the most important human insights only appeared when life slowed down enough for the mind to wander. And to Aristotle, leisure wasn't the reward you got after finishing your work. It was the reason you worked in the first place. He wrote it directly in his Politics, around 350 BC. We are busy so that we may have leisure, not the other way around. A person who was always busy but never stopped to think, never reflected, never contemplated. Aristotle didn't call that person hardworking, he called that person a slave. And Plato had a word for the condition of constant busyness, ascolia. He described it as a pathology, a sickness of the mind and society. The two greatest philosophers of the ancient world looked at a life with no stillness in it and called it a disease. We built an entire civilization around it and called it progress. But ancient Greece wasn't alone in understanding this. Nowhere was this more seriously protected than inside the monasteries of medieval Europe. Around 530 AD, a monk named Benedict wrote a document. It would govern how hundreds of thousands of people lived for the next 1,000 years. It specified exactly what monks did with every hour of every day. When they prayed, when they worked, when they ate, and when they were silent. Every night from 8 p.m. until dawn, no one spoke, not a word. The commitment was so absolute that monks developed an entire alternative language just to avoid breaking it. Around 150 hand signs. Signs for bread, signs for water, signs for book. In winter, the daily schedule set aside up to 6 or 7 hours for divine reading. Not studying, not analyzing. Just sitting quietly with a short passage of text. Just letting it settle. For 1,000 years, the most educated people in Western civilization built their entire lives around one conviction. That the quiet hours were when the most important work happened. Not the work you could see. The work happening inside. And the data from across human history confirms exactly this. For most of human history, the average person worked around 15 to 20 hours a week. Not per day, per week. Researchers from University College London studied the Agta people of the Philippines. They recorded what 359 people did every hour of every day. The pure foragers worked around 20 hours a week. Then some communities started farming. Work hours jumped by 10 hours a week. Women in farming communities had half the leisure time of women who still foraged. Marshall Solins at the University of Chicago called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society. Not because they had more things, because they had more time. Imagine having 20 hours a week that were simply yours. No notifications, no deadlines, no inbox, just time. That was the default human experience for 200,000 years. And in all that time and in all that stillness, the greatest minds in history did their best work. These weren't idle people. It is 1665. A plague has swept across England. Cambridge closes its doors, and a 23-year-old student named Isaac Newton picks up his bag and walks home. Home is Woolsthorpe Manor, a quiet stone farmhouse surrounded by fields and orchards in Lincolnshire. The world has gone still. No lectures, no colleagues, no obligations. Just a young man and an enforced stillness he did not ask for. And in that stillness, he developed calculus. Worked on optics, and one afternoon walked out to the orchard, sat down, in what he later described to his friend William Stukeley as a contemplative mood. His own words for it, a contemplative mood, and watched an apple fall. That single question, asked by a mind with nowhere else to be, eventually became the Principia Mathematica, published 22 years later. Darwin had a different relationship with stillness, not sudden isolation. Routine. Every day after working at his desk he walked, a looping path behind his home at Down House in Kent. Part shaded and cool, part opening toward wide grassy fields. He called it the Sandwalk. Sometimes he placed small flints beside the trail to count his laps. His son Francis later wrote that Darwin used these walks for hard thinking. Not rest, hard thinking. The ideas never came at the desk. They came on the Sandwalk, every time, for 20 years. Archimedes had been wrestling with a problem for weeks. Prove whether a king's crown was pure gold, without melting it down. Nothing worked. Then one evening he stepped into a bath, felt the water rise slowly around him, and in that single moment the answer arrived. Not because he was thinking harder, because he had finally stopped. The bath wasn't where he went to think. It was where he went to stop thinking, and that is exactly when the answer came. In 2014, researchers at Stanford confirmed what these people had discovered by accident. Walking raised creative output by up to 80%. Not running, not meditating, just walking. The same thing Darwin did on the Sandwalk, every single day. The breakthroughs didn't come despite the stillness. They came because of it. So what changed? How did we go from a species that understood the value of stillness to one that sits in a quiet room and presses a button to shock itself? In the 18th and 19th centuries, every hour suddenly had a price. You weren't just working, you were selling time. And time that wasn't being sold was time that was being wasted. Historian E.P. Thompson called it time discipline. Clock time wasn't just a way to measure the day. It was a way to measure a person. Are you productive? Are you punctual? Are you useful? The Puritan work ethic had been building for over a century. Idleness wasn't just wasteful. It was sinful, a sign of weak character, a moral failing. The factories didn't create that idea. They industrialized it. And by the time the 20th century arrived, the idea that stillness had value was gone. Not banned, not destroyed. Just quietly made impossible to justify. And nobody noticed it disappearing until the thing that replaced stillness arrived, and it fit perfectly in your pocket. Which brings us back to that room in Virginia. The white walls, the single chair, the button. Aristotle called constant busyness a disease. Monks built entire lives around protecting silence. Hunter-gatherers worked 20 hours a week so they could simply be. Newton and Darwin and Archimedes did their greatest work in enforced quiet. And here we are, choosing pain over silence. In 2024, researchers tracked how many times parents picked up their phones every day. Objectively measured, 93 times per day. 293 notifications arriving to prompt each one. That same year, researchers at the University of Toronto found that scrolling when bored didn't reduce the boredom, it made it worse. A study tracking over 100,000 adolescents found boredom rising every single year for nearly a decade straight, despite having access to more entertainment than any humans who have ever lived. The phone isn't solving the problem. It is the problem. And the numbers are starting to show exactly what that means. In 2011, researcher Kyung-hee Kim analyzed creative thinking scores from 272,599 Americans tested across 6 decades, falling since 1990. Fluency, the ability to generate ideas, falling. Originality, the ability to produce something genuinely new, falling. Elaboration, the ability to develop an idea into something real, falling across every single age group. While IQ scores were rising, while academic performance was going up, creative thinking was going down, steepest decline in the youngest children, kindergarten through 3rd grade, something was being switched off, and nobody noticed. But it wasn't just creativity. Sarah Conrath at the University of Michigan analyzed empathy data from 72 samples of college students, stretching from 1979 to 2009. She published her findings in the Personality and Social Psychology Review. 2 things were declining: the ability to care about what another person is going through, and the ability to see the world through someone else's eyes. Steepest drop after 2000. The same year, screens moved from desks into pockets. We didn't just lose the ability to sit with ourselves. We started losing the ability to sit with each other. And remember the network Raichle found? The one that builds your creativity and your empathy and your sense of self. Here's what happens to it when it never gets to run. The DMN is designed to alternate on when you rest, off when you focus, on, off. When every quiet moment is filled with stimulation, that rhythm breaks, and the same disrupted patterns researchers find in those brains show up consistently in people suffering from anxiety, depression, PTSD. Neuroscience cannot say your phone is causing depression, but it can say this: a brain that never gets stillness starts to look like a brain in trouble. And that raises a question nobody's asking. If the damage comes from silencing boredom, what was boredom actually trying to do? It wasn't empty, it was a signal. Psychologist John Eastwood at York University defined it precisely. Boredom is the state of wanting to engage, but being unable to find it. Your attention searching for something meaningful and not finding it. That is not a malfunction. That is a message. Think of it like pain. You're not supposed to enjoy it. You are supposed to listen to it. Researcher Sandy Mann at the University of Lancashire found that when people sit with boredom, genuinely sit with it, the mind starts generating its own stimulation, its own ideas, its own connections. Boredom properly experienced doesn't stay boredom. It becomes something else, but only if you let it. Researchers Van Tilburg and Ego published their findings in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology. They found that boredom is connected to one thing above everything else: not distraction, not stimulation. Meaning. When they made life feel more meaningful, boredom dropped. When they just improved people's mood without adding meaning, boredom stayed. Boredom isn't about how you feel. It's about whether what you're doing matters. Every time you reach for your phone, the moment boredom arrives. You are not just avoiding discomfort. You are avoiding the question boredom was trying to ask. What would actually make this life feel like enough? For 300,000 years, your ancestors sat with that question. Picture an evening thousands of years ago. The hunt is over. The fire burns low beneath the night sky. A small group sits together in the darkness, children pressed close, elders watching the flame. Beyond the firelight, everything disappears into blackness. No screens, no notifications, no noise. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years studying evenings like this among the Jew/Huansi of the Kalahari. During the day, conversation focused on practical things: food, tasks, work. But at night around the fire, everything changed. 8 out of 10 nighttime conversations were stories. Stories about ancestors, about distant places, about meaning. They sat in that darkness and told each other who they were. They asked the questions that became philosophy. They sat in silence long enough to hear something that only speaks in quiet. Every generation of humans who ever lived sat in some version of that circle, wondering, thinking, becoming. We are the first generation who never have to. Not in the elevator, not in the queue, not lying awake at 2 a.m. Not ever, and we call that progress. But look at what we traded. Creativity declining in the youngest children, empathy eroding in the years, screens entered our pockets. A brain that never gets stillness, starting to look like a brain in trouble, and a generation more bored than any before them, despite never having to sit with boredom at all. The network Marcus Raichle found in 2001, the one his colleagues tried to explain away as a mistake, turns out to be the most important network in your brain. Not the one that runs when you're focused, the one that runs when you're doing nothing. Newton felt it beneath an apple tree in a contemplative mood. Darwin felt it on a sandy loop through trees and hedges in Kent. Archimedes felt it in a bath. They didn't reach for anything. They just sat there, and the answers came. You don't have to give up your phone. You don't have to move to a monastery. The only question is whether you're willing to sit with it long enough to hear it. Because the question boredom is asking is the most important question you will ever be asked. What would actually make this life feel like enough? For 300,000 years, that question lived in the silence. We filled the silence and forgot to answer it.